Yes, I am here. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm here.
All right. Thank you. I am just getting. All right. Thank you. I'm just getting ready to. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Just give me 1 minute. I need to. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry for the delay. So today we want to focus more on quantitative research. That's our focus for today. The focus is on quantitative research. Okay, so like I was saying, the focus today is to discuss quantitative research. That's our focus. And when we talk about quantitative research, we are talking about a methodology that involves systematic collection of numerical information under the condition of considerable control. So that's the major issue there with quantitative research. So when we do this kind of research, we still need to remember these components when choosing a research approach: the philosophy, the designs, and the methods that we are looking at. This should always stick into our minds. So, like what I preempted earlier on, we use quantitative research based on what Dr. Murray said 3 weeks ago when he presented about philosophies. In quantitative research, our idea is we assume the world is stable, we assume the world is uniform, and as a result, we can make broad generalizations from this. That's the general idea of this. And when we do quantitative research, we want to investigate a topic through measurement of variables, and this measurement should be done in quantifiable terms. We want to measure relationships between variables. We want to find whether this variable causes this other variable, or whether this has an indirect effect and this one has a direct effect. So quantitative research, it relies more on collection and analysis of numerical data, like what I said. And we want to do this in order to explain a variable of interest, in order to predict a variable of interest, in order also to control a variable of interest. And when we do quantitative research, conclusions are not meaningful unless we can verify these conclusions. So when we make our conclusions in quantitative research, it means you are in a position to verify these conclusions based on direct observation of the relationship between variables and based on the measurement of the variables. So unlike in qualitative research, there is really need for you to be in a position to separate facts from feelings. In quantitative research, the world exists on facts that are discovered from observations and measurements. I don't know whether Dr. Murray, you want to come in there and make some comments.
For now, you can proceed. Let me just come in now. Maybe let me come in on this particular slide that you've just moved on to. The other issue that we just want to foreground here is that quantitative research methods also is based on what we call a deductive approach, or it's also called a deductive logic. Some also call it a top-down logic. Basically, what we are saying is that the process here of reasoning is from one or more statements or premises is used to reach a logically certain conclusion. So you use one premise then to be able to reach a certain logical conclusion based on premises or based on a hypothesis, as we are going to discuss in this particular session. Again, in terms of the deductive approach, the issue is to say that it is aimed at testing theory rather than the generation of new theory from data. So you will see that qualitative studies pretty much try to generate new theory from data. That's why they are based on what we call an inductive approach or a bottom-up logic. Whereas, quantitative is pretty much about, it's about trying to test existing theories already. That's pretty much the logic around, the deductive approach that quantitative research methods actually use. And again, we are saying deductive approaches tend to focus more on causality. So it's about cause and effect studies. So you've seen, studies where, for example, A causes B or B is correlated with C. So it's about cause and effect that is also in the center of this particular approach. An example that I can give in terms of using a deductive reasoning would be, for example, let's say you have the first premise that you probably have is to say all men are mortal, and then the next premise that you can have, for example, is to say all philosophers are human beings. Again, this is pretty much almost like your second premise, but again, it's being derived from the first premise where we are saying all men are mortal, and therefore we are also saying all philosophers are also part of being human beings. Again, the other issue that you also need to note in terms of this deductive approach is to say deductive arguments are always evaluated in terms of their validity and also in terms of their soundness. So as you are going to see in this particular session, deductive approach are pretty much associated with quantitative research methods, and they are at the center, in terms of what we call quantitative research methodology in research. I will hand over to Dr. Woyo, who will come back to some of these issues in the next slides.
Okay, so quantitative research, it operates under widely agreed steps. So when we do quantitative research, we have got a number of agreed steps that we need to observe, especially in the research process. And these steps are well established, and there is no flexibility in terms of strategies one can use when you are doing quantitative research, unlike when you are working on qualitative research. So when we talk about quantitative research, we are simply saying nothing is left to chance. So that's the reason why we need to follow agreed steps that guides the research process. We don't leave things to chance, and no aspect of the design is actually permitted to emerge when the study has started or when the research has started. Perhaps in qualitative that could be accepted, but we don't leave things to chance. You need to think through about the design, and you need to think through that these issues are not going to just change once you have started the process. So in qualitative research, the researcher is deeply immersed into the research setting, like what we discussed last week among the participants. But in quantitative research, the researcher has to remain objective as much as is possible. And as a researcher, you need to recognize your own biases, you need to recognize your own limitations. So, and like I said earlier on when we started about these approaches, don't ever think that quantitative is the opposite of qualitative. These are just two different research methodologies that follow different patterns, and it doesn't go beyond that. So in quantitative research, while in qualitative research, the researcher is the main person, is immersed in the research process. Quantitative research follows a different approach. All the researcher has to do is to make sure you are objective, is to make sure that you recognize your weaknesses, you recognize your biases, your limitations. And in quantitative research, the research process is much more linear. When you compare this to qualitative, we follow steps, and these steps, they need to be observed in a much more linear relationship, in a much more linear progression. And the focus is more on objectivity, so that at the end, the results that you find, you will be able to generalize them beyond the current situation that you are looking at. You would be able to generalize them to a much bigger population, to a much bigger context, and all that. I'm not sure if Dr. Mari wants to come in here.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing, as you have already pointed out, is that when we are looking at quantitative research, the most important thing is to look at it from a point where the researcher tries to be a disinterested observer. You want to remove yourself from the object of study as much as possible. You try and make sure that you maintain distance between the research setting and the researched. And in that way, the assumption and also the belief, therefore, is to say you are going to be able to achieve what we call objectivity in research. And again, we are also saying, in terms of quantitative research, literature review is also very important, because it serves as the justification for research problem, regardless of the type of the research that you are doing. And again, we are also saying it also plays a central role even in terms of the design of the quantitative study. So you need to read your literature so that you can be able to get as much background information, and also to get as much in terms of what other quantitative instruments other people have used. You also need to be able to understand your population sizes. You also need to understand your population frame, the sampling frame that you are dealing with. And also, you also need to know the methods of analysis that other people have already used before you can then move on and say, this is pretty much what you are going to do. So again, we are saying it's very important, even at a level of data collection, that the methods of collection, sampling, procedures should not change throughout the whole process. It should remain very inflexible. So one can actually say, unlike qualitative studies, which pretty much are very flexible, less rigid, quantitative is very rigid and inflexible, because the ultimate goal is to make sure that you achieve objectivity. And you can only achieve this objectivity when you try and make sure that you adhere to the research instrument, you adhere to your sampling techniques. If you have said you want to use systematic sampling techniques, if you have said you want to use simple random techniques, make sure then you use that, so that you can be able to achieve that objectivity, and also to make sure that you achieve what we call reliability at the level of quantitative research. I hand over back to Dr. Woyo.
All right. So like what Dr. Mari was saying, you really need to do proper literature review, because it is from the proper literature review that you'll be able to build up skills that would inform your instrumentation design, that would inform your population, that is going to inform the methods of the methods of data analysis. So when you do literature review, it's not only about finding the gap and locating the studies. You also need to do this thinking about, in literature, how do I find the skills that I need to use in order for me to design my instrument for quantitative research. Then it also going to inform you the kind of methodologies and the methods of data analysis other scholars have used And you also try to think around, if I use this scale, what could be my method of analysis? If I develop a scale like this, what kind of population would I need? If I develop a scale like this, what kind of methodology would I need? And you, quantitative research is also characteristic of its purpose. The purpose in quantitative research is very specific and it is very narrow. One can actually measure, one can actually do a study on just two variables. The effect of, let's say, customer loyalty, the effect of maybe customer satisfaction on customer loyalty. That can be my focus. It's very specific and it's very narrow. I am simply focusing on a few constructs. So in this example, I'm just focusing on two constructs, customer satisfaction and customer loyalty. Those are my constructs that I need to measure. Then you also need to make sure that when you are measuring this, your method of data collection speaks to these constructs. Your sample speaks to these constructs. In quantitative research, we are more worried about bigger sample size because the idea is to generalize the findings that one would have generated, is to generalize the findings into other contexts, apart from the context that you are specifically looking at. And I need to underline what Dr. Mari has already said, that we don't change the method of analysis, we don't change the method of design, we don't change the method of selection once the research process has begun. Remember, objectivity is the goal in quantitative research. So once you change that, then it means objectivity is not going to be in place. So for you to achieve generalizability of your results, your sampling should be more on the random side. So it should be more on the probabilistic side of methods of selection, because randomization is likely to give you a more generalized outcome than non-probability sampling techniques would do. So for generalizability, focus more on random selection of participants, focus more on larger samples of participants. So I think these days people are talking about 1,000 or more participants in a particular study measuring a particular construct for you to be able to generalize that, because 1,000 is actually big enough a sample for you to be able to generalize. And the sample that you need to select, it should be representative of the population that you are dealing with. And it's quite important that in quantitative research, you are able to establish the population of the study for you to be able to come up with a representative sample that you need to randomly select. So like I said, you should be more concerned about using probability considerations, simple random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster, or even multi-stage sampling techniques, because this is very important for you to achieve generalizability and for you to achieve representativeness of your study. So in terms of data analysis in quantitative methods or in quantitative research is purely statistical. You cannot analyze it in themes, you cannot analyze it in narratives, you cannot analyze it anyhow except using numbers. So it's purely statistical, and you should interpret the statistics that you would have generated. Remember, the goal of quantitative research is to be very objective. And the way we report our results in quantitative methods is more fixed. You don't have any flexibility. You need to follow a certain structure of doing that. Over to you, Dr. Mari, if you have anything to say.
Yes, I just want to add that in terms of making sure that you achieve the best results at quantitative, I think you have to stick to this, probability sampling techniques, because once you don't, you digress from this, it becomes something else. It moves away from being a qualitative study and from a quantitative study, and then probably becomes maybe a quantitative or a qualitative study, or even becomes a mixed method kind of an approach. So it's very important that you adhere to simple random sampling techniques, stratified sampling techniques, or even systematic, depending on the nature of the problem that you are dealing with. But once you have decided this is the sampling technique that I want to adhere to, make sure that you follow the strict guidelines that are that accompany that particular sampling technique that you would have achieved, followed. But also make sure that you also use, statistical data analysis techniques and tools and even softwares to make sure that you make sense of your data set. Because as Dr. Woyo has rightfully pointed out, everything has to be reported in terms of numerical. It's pretty much numerical data, but it's also pretty much, as we call it, statistical data. So make sure that you use the right kind of software or the right kind of formula so that you can come up with the right kind of answers that probably answers whatever you are dealing with. Otherwise, if you don't do that, the chances are that you end up not achieving what we call objectivity at the level of quantitative research methodology. Thank you, Dr. Woyo.
So when we do quantitative research, when you have presented your problem statement, it's one key area that people need to do in research. You need to identify the problem to the study or to the studies that you are doing. And once you have identified the problem, can the problem be narrowed down into few variables? Because it's actually very important for you to have variables. Which of these variables are your independent variables? Which of these variables are your intervening variables? And which of these ones are the outcome variables? So it's actually key that in your problem statement, if you are doing a quantitative research, you are in a position to narrow down your problem into variables, to say, okay, these are my independent variables, and this is my intervening, if you have, or these are my independent, and these are my this is my dependent variable. And after doing that, it is also very important for quantitative research or students doing studies in quantitative research to make sure that they are in a position to clearly state what their hypothesis is. And it must be clearly stated and it must be precise. So failure to do this, it means that there would be a misalignment between the data that you would have collected and the research question. Because there should be a thread leading to the variables you have identified are the hypotheses that you have formulated. So when you formulate a hypothesis, then what it means is the variables should be part of the hypothesis formulated. Otherwise, you end up having a situation where you have misalignment of the data you have in the research questions. And once there is that misalignment, then what it means is you cannot probably analyze that particular data and meet or achieve and solve the research questions that you have, or achieve the objectives that you have. And even at this point, your supervisor can actually tell you to go back and reconstruct everything and recollect new data or fresh data because of that misalignment. So we need to avoid a misalignment between the data and the questions and our proposed analytical techniques as the study is progressing. So remember, it's something that we cannot correct later. If you have a wrong footing of how you have formulated your objectives, then it means you are going to have problems with your analysis and problems with many other stuff. So I put this literature review back again to say, like, if you don't do it properly, then it means your design is not going to be informed correctly. Then it means your sampling method is not going to be informed correctly. Then it means the instrument that you have designed is actually a weak instrument that doesn't help you to meet the objectives, that doesn't help you to answer the research questions, that doesn't help you to meet the information that you would need in terms of how do you accept the hypothesis that you have formulated. So instrumentation becomes critical in all that, and even the development of the scales that you are going to use. So if you can't narrow down the variables, it means you cannot develop the scales for each variable. It means you cannot develop the items for each variable. And then data collection becomes a mess, and many other things, and even its analysis becomes a mess. So it's important that these processes, these aspects are followed up and they are done properly. So you also need to come up with a plan. What is your plan regarding selection of the sample? What is your plan regarding the design? What is your plan regarding data collection? You should plan this beforehand, before you coming in to do what you are supposed to do in the research. And data collection in quantitative research takes a lot of time. Um, when using surveys or a test or whatever instrument you are using, it takes time. Remember the large sample size I was talking about. So if you are to collect data from 1,000 participants, it's not a 1 day's job. It's not even a month's job. It can be months' jobs. So you can actually do that in months. I remember when I was collecting data for my PhD, it took me months to collect data from the suppliers and to collect data from the demand side. So depending on the nature of your study, data collection can take time, and it requires you to have a good and a solid plan regarding all that. So thanks to technology, we are using statistical softwares like SPSS, Atlas TI is not supposed to be there, but SPSS, eViews, Stata, Amos, and all that. Those are correct examples of what we use when we are doing analysis of quantitative research. Dr. Murray?
Yeah, I just want to support what you've just said in terms of making sure that you correctly identify the problem or to be studied. I think that's the right word, to be studied, to identify the correct problem that needs to be studied. Once you have done that, proceed to actually develop a very good hypothesis that can then drive the whole, the whole chain in terms of what are the research questions to be looked at. How am I going to analyze this data? But also a very important aspect of this process is also to make sure that you do a thorough review of existing literature, because this will also inform the design. It will also inform your sampling techniques. It will also, it will also inform the instruments that you're also going to develop and the skills that you're also going to develop for this particular kind of research, and also ultimately guide the data collection procedures in data analysis. Because without that, it becomes very difficult to know what others have already done in terms of that particular research that you're already doing. Because remember, as we've already pointed out, quantitative studies tend to be very rigid and inflexible, and as such, it means to you to adhere to existing, existing, not only existing literature, but also existing instruments that are there, so that somebody, whoever is going to do that study, even if they have to do that study maybe in Australia or do it in Canada, they should be more or less arrive at almost the same kind of, findings that you're going to use. It's unlike in a qualitative study where probably the context in which you are doing study probably may differ from and even the instrument that you're going to use may also be different from the one that probably somebody is going to use, because of contextual differences, but also even cultural differences that also come into these things. So it's pretty much different in that sense, and it's very important that you make sure that you do the right thing by doing your job in terms of making sure that you correctly identify the problem, then move on with these steps to make sure that you develop the right kind of skills, but also the right kinds of instrument that can actually collect the data. Because if you then also develop a wrong instrument, it's also going to come up also with wrong data, because that also affects the way how we're also going to analyze that data set. So it's very important that you make sure that you consult literature, you see the right kind of formulas in terms of what skills would work in my particular context, what others have done, and then from there build on a case to say, this is what I'm also going to do in my own context. But as we have already pointed out, it's very important that you adhere to the guidelines in terms of what a quantitative research should actually achieve, because otherwise, if you don't do that, it becomes very difficult for you then to generalize, but also even to make sure that you claim that your study actually represents that particular context that you said you were actually studying. So representativity and also generalizability becomes very key terms in quantitative studies. I don't know if Dr. Oyo is back.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, so moving on to as a way of just laying these fundamentals in quantitative research, this is a checklist that you would need to tick, and every box must be ticked. So when you are doing a quantitative research, you need to be sure, have you stated the purpose of using quantitative research in your methodology section, whether in a proposal or in a thesis? It's very important for you to be able to do that. Secondly, so is the purpose of the survey design stated? The design that you would have chosen needs to be stated. And more to that, you also need to give us reasons why a quantitative research method was preferred ahead of a qualitative or ahead of mixed methods and some other forms of research. Then thirdly, it is important that in quantitative research, you know the population. Is the population and the size mentioned? So you need to mention the population. How big is this population? Is the population, can the population be determined, established, and its size be established? And after doing that, you need to also indicate, will the population, are you going to put this population into a strata? If so, how are you going to do all that? And how many people are going to be part of the sample for the research that you are working on? So after identifying the sample, it's important for you after identifying the population, it's important for you to determine how big is the size. So how many people will be in the sample? And when you do this, you need to remember representativity in your mind. You need to remember that the sample has to be representative in order for the findings to be generalizable. And on what basis was this sample selected? So there is need for justification. Why is 300 enough? Why not 500 and all that? So when you are writing methodology, it's important that every bit of information you put in the methodology chapter or in the proposal is justified. What is the justification to all that? So when you also need to indicate the method of selecting the participants or the sample. Was it random? Was it non-random? Was it probability? And was it non-probability? And why non-probability? And perhaps why probability? All those issues, they need to be articulated more clearly. And when it comes to instrumentation, we are more worried about you telling us what is the instrument you used. Did you use a test? Did you use a questionnaire? Did you use quantitative interviews? Did you use quantitative observations? And this instrument you have used, are you the one who developed it? And if you are the one who developed it, how did you develop it? Was it informed by literature, or you adopted scales from certain previous researchers that have measured the same concept? And if you have identified that there are also issues of you need to note issues of how reliable was that particular instrument when the researchers initially used that particular instrument, and how valid was it and all that. So tell us what the instrument is that you are going to use or that you are using, and who has developed it. And if you have modified it, which sections of the instrument have been modified? If you are adapting it, which have you been given permission to use that particular instrument by the researcher who have previously used that or who has developed that? And you also need to mention what are the areas that are addressed in the instrument, which section covers demographics, which section covers which construct. So if you have got customer satisfaction, you would need to say section B would cover customer satisfaction, section C would cover customer loyalty, and I'm going to use a Likert scale. 1 means strongly agree, 5 means strongly disagree, or vice versa, or 1 to 7. These issues, they need to be clear, and they need to be highlighted more perfectly in the study. What procedure are you going to use in piloting the study? Who are you piloting to? How is that sample for a pilot determined? If you are piloting to academics, what's the reason for piloting to academics? If you are piloting to customers, what's the reason of piloting to customers? How do you determine the sample for that? And you need to describe that fully. You also need to indicate the timeline for administering the survey. When is the survey going to be administered? There are some studies that are affected by seasons, and you need to justify that. No, I'm distributing this in winter because the study that I'm doing, it focuses maybe on why people drink more tea, so you are likely to get more participants during that time, and all that kind of stuff. So you need to mention the timeline and explain and justify why that timeline is important for your survey. You also need to indicate what your variables are in terms of the study that you are doing. Independent variables, dependent variables, intervening variables, if you have, and how do these variables cross-reference with the research questions. So there is need for you to make sure that the variables you have identified, they speak to the questions you are dealing with in your study, and the items you have put in the instrument, they speak to these variables, they speak to the research questions. Otherwise, you're going to collect data that is not useful, data that doesn't answer any of your research questions. So it's actually very important that you take care of all this. And you also need to do a checklist regarding the steps that you're going to take when doing analysis of the data. How do you analyze the returns of the questionnaires that you have received? How do you check response bias? How do you do your descriptive analysis? Which statistics are you going to use? Are you going to use simply the means, the standard deviations, and the frequencies to do all that? How do you collapse the scales? How do you collapse the items into scales? And how do you check the reliability of all these? Are you going to do a factor analysis to collapse the scales as a way of doing data reduction? And are you going to use the Cron-Basel alpha to check whether these scales are reliable or not? Then you also need to talk about how are you going to run inferential statistics to answer some of your research questions? Because descriptive results doesn't answer anything. You are simply describing the sample and it ends there. We need rigorous statistics in order for you to be in a position to answer. So if you are measuring the relationship between something, one would expect you to give us good statistics, starting maybe from the correlations, the confirmatory, the regression analysis, so that we arrive at a practical conclusion, at a situation where the research questions have been properly answered. So for you to come up with the practical significance of the results, you need good statistics that goes beyond simply the mean, the standard deviation, and the frequency. Those ones don't tell you anything apart from describing. I don't know, Dr. Murray, if you have anything on this checklist.
I just wanted to add on the issue that you talked about in terms of adapting other people's instruments. I think it's very important that when you adapt other people's instruments, you must be able to report on it. And also, it's very important actually that we do that most of the time, because sometimes some of these instruments are developed in the global north. For example, it can be developed in America, or it can be developed in Australia, or even in the UK. And when you want to transpose or to use the same kind, or transplant that same instrument and try to use it here in Africa, probably there are certain variables that would have changed. There are certain issues that would have changed. So you need to be able to make sure that you reflect on that. And I think it's very important so that you meet also the contextual requirements of your research setting, because remember, research context also somehow change, despite the fact that instruments should remain inflexible. But I think it's very important to adapt it to meet our needs in our context, but also the other issue is to make sure that you also seek informed consent from the people that have developed these instruments before you use them. Otherwise, you may run the risk of actually being taken to court for actually using things without prior permission. You can proceed.
Okay, one of the most important issues there in quantitative research is actually the issue of population. The issue of population is very important because we would want to know whether the sample you have selected out of that population, is it representative? So sampling is a major problem for any type of research. We can't study every case of whatever we are interested in, nor should we want to. So every scientific enterprise tries to find out something that will apply to everything of a certain kind by studying a few examples, the result of the study being, as we say, generalizable. This is our concern. This is the concern of quantitative research. We know you cannot study everything, but the sample that you are going to pick from the population, it has to be representative in order for you to be in a position to generalize the study findings that you would have generated in all that. So when it comes to population, as a researcher doing quantitative research, you need to identify the population in the study, and you should be able to state its size. So when you are writing this section, don't just simply define that target population is this and that and that and that. Go after defining, you must be in a position to identify that population, and you must be in a position to state how big is that. Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Is it 1,000,000? And the means of identifying the individuals in that population is very crucial. So you also need to indicate that you have got some access level to the population that you are studying. So simply, if you are doing a quantitative research and you don't know how many are they, I actually have a problem there, because you will not be in a position to collect that particular data from those particular people if you simply don't know how many are they, how big is this population. So after doing that, you now need to identify your sampling design of the population. Are you going to do this design using single sampling, or you are going to do multi-stage? So with the single sample design, we are simply saying, as a researcher, you have got access to the names of the population you are dealing with. You have direct access to all these people, and you can sample them directly. Then with multi-stage, we are simply saying, before we can sample them, we need to identify, you need to identify structures, or you need to identify clusters or groups in which these people fit in. Then we can do sample. So you first need to develop these clusters or the groups or the organizations. Then you obtain the names of individuals within these clusters, and then you'll be in a position to sample them. So you, like I said earlier, more good results are actually achieved by randomly selecting the participants, systematic or a probabilistic sample. So this is very critical if we are to generalize the results. But I'm not saying non-probability sampling doesn't work. All I'm saying is this one gives you more strong justification for generalizing the results. It gives you more justification for being objective. So a systematic sample so instead of random sampling, you can also use systematic sample, where we are simply saying you are going to go into your study, whatever, and collect data. Let's say I'm collecting data from multi-choice. All I'm doing is every third person to enter the building, I issue them my questionnaire. So that also become a little more good, and if you are to replace it with random sampling. Less desirable, but you can use it, is non-probability sampling techniques. For instance, convenience, simply selecting participants because they are convenient to you, they are convenient, they can do this completion of the task and all that. So you also need to identify whether your study would require you to stratify the population before selecting the sample. It's very important, especially if you are doing something where you want to really measure differences between, let's say, male and female. So it is really important that the population be stratified first if I want to measure who is more productive, female and male researchers, I should be in a position to stratify my sample first, to say these are my male researchers and these are my female researchers. And from all this, then I can even run a systematic sample from the male researchers and from the female researchers. And then my findings are going to be objective. But not all studies are like this. It's up to you, depending on the nature of the problem that you are dealing with, whether stratification is necessary or it's not necessary, whether it's necessary for you to know the characteristics of the population before you select the sample. So if you don't do that, let's say I want to find how productive are male researchers from female researchers. If I don't do this stratification, I may end up circulating my questionnaire to only male researchers. And what do? I have got useless data. So it's important that people be in a position to identify, is this a critical element of their design process in quantitative research. Indicate the sample size. It's important to know if this sample is generalizable to the population you are talking about, and also the procedures. How did you compute the sample size? Which formula did you use? Which guidelines did you use in order to arrive at this sample size? I don't know, Dr. Mari, if you have anything to say, or you can come in here on methods of data collection and instrumentation.
Let me just try and re-emphasize what you have pointed out in terms of the sampling techniques that can actually be used. And I think it's very important that you are very systematic about it. If you choose to use simple random sampling technique, which is one of the most used techniques because of its ability to generalize findings, but also its ability to achieve what we call representativity, then it's the right thing to follow. But again, if you also choose to use systematic sampling technique, it's equally valid and it's equally important. But as I've already pointed out, it would be an anomaly then when you then mix it up with sampling techniques like convenience, like snowballing, which are pretty much from a qualitative research methodology strand. So it's always very important to make sure that you are very rigorous and you adhere to these sampling techniques, because the failure to do so also affects the quality of the data that you're going to collect. And even it also will also come up, especially when you are talking about data analysis. That's when you will see that whatever you would have done is also affected by the level and the type of sampling techniques that you would have used. So it's always very important that you adhere to these things. That's why we are always talking about the rigidity that is associated with quantitative study, but it also ensures that it also achieves objectivity, but it also makes sure that you can also be clearly and confidently be able to generalize your findings and to say, this is actually what you have found out. Yeah, you can proceed, Dr. Way.
Okay, so in terms, you can actually collect this data using tests, especially those of you who do psychometric. You can measure attitudes of people, personalities, perceptions, aptitudes, performance, using tests as an instrument. You can also do that using questionnaires, where we use this as a self-report data collection instrument. In this case, each participant has to complete this part of an instrument and give it back to the researcher. We normally use closed-ended questions that have got scales in them in quantitative research, and it can be administered in a number of ways. So, and like in quantitative research, where the researcher has to be a key participant in the research process, you can ask field assistance to administer the instrument for you. You can administer it online, and quite a number of ways of making it reach the participants that you would need. And like I said earlier, when you are doing your instrumentation or designing the instrument for quantitative research, it's important for you to discuss, how was this instrument designed? Did you adopt scales from somewhere? And you cite the sources where you have adopted the scales. You also need to indicate if you have adopted the scales, if you have adopted the scales, Did you use them as they are, or you modified them? And which elements of the past instrument have you modified? And if you are developing it as a researcher, you simply say you are developing this instrument, or the instrument you are using or you are going to use, you have developed it yourself. So if modified, indicate whether the permission to use that instrument has been granted. So if it's a permission that was developed by Dr. Mare, you need to write him and ask him for his permission in order for him to grant you the permission to use the instrument as is, or to modify it to suit your study. So when you are using an existing instrument, it is important that you address issues of validity, especially in that previous study where it was used. We need to know, to have an understanding of what was the issue around the content validity of that instrument. What did the researchers say about their instrument? The items that they used, did they measure what they intended to measure? Secondly, we are also concerned about you talking or discussing about predictive validity. That instrument you are adopting, or that instrument you want to use, an existing instrument, when it was used, did it predict a criterion measure or not? The results that came out of that particular study that used that particular instrument, did it correlate with other results from other researchers, from other study findings on the same topic, on the same constructs, but different instruments or different aspects being measured? Then we are also worried about you thinking about construct validity. The items that were used by the researchers in the previous study, did they measure the hypothetical constructs, or did they measure the hypothetical aspects of the concept that you are trying to do? And then finally, you also need to make sure that when you are looking at your instrument that you have adopted, you also need to tell us how reliable was that instrument, especially in terms of internal consistency reported through the Cronbach alpha values. Where was it reliable? We normally say if it's reliable, then the alpha value should always be 0.70. Anything less than that, it means the instrument itself was not reliable. The scales that were used in that particular study itself was not reliable. And are these items consistent across constructs? It's one of the things that you need to think about, especially if you are adopting an instrument. Are the scores that you are using, are the scores that have been generated by that particular instrument, are they really stable over time? And if we were to administer it for the second time, do you really think that we're going to get probably similar results? Because that's the idea, in quantitative research, that should you want to do this probably for the second time, you must perhaps get more or less similar results in all that. So determine if there was consistency in the administration of the instrument, in the scoring of the results. Were there errors that could have been caused by carelessness on part of how the instrument was administered? If you read in the methodology, you're going to pick these issues and then report them as you try to do your own research. So these are issues. So if you're adopting an existing scale, is not an issue, but you need to address these issues and keep them in check. So if you modify or you combine two or more instruments, then these aspects are not going to hold, because if you modify an instrument, then it becomes a new instrument. If we modify a product, then it becomes a new product. So if we modify an instrument, or if you combine my instrument, Dr. Mare's instrument, Anneli's instrument, then you are developing a new instrument. So these aspects of validity are not going to be reported now, but you need to report them in your findings to say if your instrument that you have developed, what is the issue regarding construct validity, predictive validity, and content validity, and all that. So it is a new instrument, and you need to establish its validity, and you need to establish whether the scales that you have used in that new instrument were valid or not. So it's those issues that you need to indicate when you are developing your instrument. Also indicate what are the major contents of the instrument, which section covers the demographics, which section covers which variable, and etc. etc. I talked about pilot studying. It's important you discuss the plans for pilot studying, and you also discuss, if it's in a proposal, you need to mention that once the pilot results are back, the researcher would use the feedback to improve the content validity of the instrument, to improve the structuring of the questions, to format the scales, and to improve the scales, or to format how the instrument is looking like, and all that. And also indicate the number of people you are going to test the instrument, and the plans to incorporate their comments, so that you have got an improved instrument that you would have designed. So Dr. Mario, you can come in there and try to put in some flesh to what I was talking about. You are muted.
What I was saying is that if you have also modified an instrument, it's also very important when you are reporting also to report on its weaknesses, so that anybody else who is going to use that same instrument must also take note before they actually use it. So it's very important, as Dr. Woy was saying, as you also read other people's work, you would see that they usually report about certain problems that they actually encountered, whether the instrument failed at the level of content validity, whether the instrument also failed at the level of predictive validity, or even construct validity. So you must also do the same with your instrument, because as you administer this instrument, you are going to be able to pick up certain issues that are going to recur, in terms of probably people are saying they are probably not able to understand probably what you were trying to raise with through your particular instrument. So it's also very important that you report on the weaknesses or the internal inconsistencies that probably your instrument comes with, so that other people can also actually reflect on that before they use it. Because remember, once you come up with an instrument, you're already contributing towards knowledge production. So anybody else who wants to use that same instrument must also be aware of the things that they have to be able to take note before they actually use it. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult for others to use to reflect on their own work. So it's very important. And I think right now, given that we are in the COVID era, I think we also need to start reflecting on how we can actually do this online questionnaires and all that kind of things like SurveyMonkey, for example. How do we do SurveyMonkey so that we can still be able to achieve issues around social distancing, and all these other things that we are dealing with right now. So I think also we also need to start thinking about how do we digitize our research methods in quantitative research, so that they can still be able to be done. For example, how can you actually use Google Documents to actually package your questionnaire, so that you can administer it to as many people as you want. Otherwise, if you don't do that, it becomes very difficult, because right now we are dealing with a very serious pandemic that probably is not going to allow you to be able to go out into the field and actually administer these questionnaires face to face. So probably administering a questionnaire using an email could be an issue that you can start thinking about. You can also even start thinking about developing SurveyMonkey, or even using Google Docs actually to come up with these questionnaires, so that you can then be able. But again, still you have to reflect around the issues around probability sampling. How are you going to ensure that when you use those particular technologies? So it's also very important that you think about that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mari. And I think one more issue to reiterate is, for those who are doing doctoral studies, a PhD is awarded based on your contribution to literature, that is knowledge, on your contribution to methodology. So what Dr. Mari was saying in terms of you noting down the weaknesses of an instrument, it goes on to add to your methodological contribution. So you are awarded the doctoral degree based on your contribution to knowledge, based on your contribution to methodology, and based on your contribution to practice. So it's actually very important for people to do all that. So I think we have come to the end of our presentation. So if people have got questions, we can entertain them and then see how far we can go with this discussion, maybe for the next 10-15 minutes. So I think it looks like the participants today have no issues. So we thank you for.
It was all clear. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Okay, so if there are no issues, thank you for logging in and for listening to us. We wish you all the best in your research, writing, masters, PhDs. Those of you who are writing articles, we really wish you all the best in your studies. I will leave this to Dr. Mary maybe for some closing remarks before we sign off.
Yeah, I think I just want to thank the participants for being with us once again. And I hope that next week again, we will meet on the same platform and we continue with another topic. Probably we will see what to look at. If we don't probably focus, probably we may think of actually focusing more on quantitative data analysis, maybe in depth, and look at how actually you can actually do that at a practical level. Or if we don't do, probably we may end up probably looking at the mixed method approach and how you can actually mix these qualitative and quantitative, given that, you know, some actually are doing those kinds of studies. So we'll see what works, but essentially we want to continue with the momentum and we want to continue to share knowledge as much as we can. Thank you so much.
All right, so thank you everyone. Have a good weekend. See you. Bye.